Okay, welcome back from your break, everybody. I would also like to welcome back Siobhan Haimé. You presented yesterday for us and you've come back for a second day, so we didn't scare you off. Excellent. Siobhan's going to be talking to us about dimensions of diversity, which I believe is a piece of work you've been doing outside of your usual day job. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Take it away.
Thank you. Yes, so as Darren said, I will be talking today about reading list diversity. And I just want to preface that whilst I have used my professional slide deck, I've just realized this is not work that I have done as part of my day job, and therefore it is also unaffiliated to my place of work. Just so that is clear, I realized I should probably use a different slide format for that. So just to give an overview, I will start with a brief introduction. Then I will give some background to this work, which is also having done a systematic search. Then I will discuss what is in the lists and why we use lists. Then I will talk through the aforementioned dimensions of diversity as well, of kind of the model I work with. And then we'll do a brief activity. The activity part of the session will not be recorded. For this, I will invite you both or either or to participate in a Padlet or to participate in a discussion. I realize that some modes of interaction might be more comfortable for others, and giving the heads up might be helpful. So you can either participate in writing in the chat or on the Padlet, or participate by joining the discussion, and just so you know that in advance. So yeah, how it started out with a list, how did it end up like this? So in June 2020, in response to George Floyd death, which is actually the 3rd-year anniversary of today, a group of scholars that I was involved in started the Ethnomethodology and Conversation Analysis for Social Justice Working Group, which is an international scholarly collective that does data sessions, discussions, reading groups, and we also made a syllabus. Because outside of being a library assistant, I am also a PhD student, and I specifically look at conversation analysis. So to give a bit of background to this work, what happened is that in response to these events, we looked at our scholarly body of literature and the data. And we very much came to the conclusion that our work is, well, I think undiverse isn't even cutting it, and that we have methods and methodologies that would allow us to look at issues around race and racism and inequality, but that our field has what we call a methodological Switzerland approach. So we have a very strong approach to neutrality, and saying that we as researchers and observers are neutral towards our data and the phenomena we study. And the point of this group was also to, I think, to challenge this notion and to see how we could use the work that we do and our research to address issues around race, but also to make our practices more inclusive and more, I think, representative of what we do. So I think it might be relevant to know that I started this work before I ever worked in a library. So I started this from an academic point of view. And it's very much a complete coincidence that I ended up working as a reading list assistant currently, which I think maybe the job was made for me there. So as a part of this group, I looked at creating a syllabus or a reading list. And initially, this was, I think, a very helpful and useful thing to do. And as I worked more and more on it, I spot a lot of problems with this approach. And it sort of evolved entirely outside of its remit and its subject area, which is the work you're about to see here. And we've had like a lot of like change within this group, because it's obviously been 3 years and a lot has changed. I do still work with them, and I currently work on representative open research data for the field and making sure that we have open data that is not from the 1960s, because a lot of our data was, to be very frank, middle-class white people in the 1960s talking about their dinner plans, which just isn't very good from a scholarly point of view either. And where alternative data was created or recorded, it often wasn't shared or open. So that is part of the remit as well. And I think on a more personal note, because I don't have a set positionality statement here, but I'll be kind of weaving it into my presentation. One of the reasons I've been involved in this group is because I am mixed race and I am white passing, but nevertheless, I don't often see myself represented in either my work or I think in the literature itself. I think for me, up until I joined this, I wasn't quite aware, but when I thought about research, I kind of thought about this separate bubble that was split from myself, that I studied but didn't have people like me in it. And I think it always felt a bit alienating. And I think, as also the presentation in class mentioned, you sometimes feel like you walk into a place and it wasn't made for you. And I think that is part of my motivation on working on this and why I initially worked on reading lists. So I've changed a lot since then. And I think on a personal level, it's also been really good for me because it was the first time that I met someone who was like me in my field. And I think to this day, I have only really met one person who I spoke to and I was like, you understand my experience. And I remember actually crying a little bit when this happened because it was the first time I met someone who was mixed race from a similar background as myself, who I think had also had this kind of, I'm going to say, ethnically ambiguous background where you don't fit into one category, you don't fit into the other, and you sort of float about. And I think that is something maybe perhaps to keep in mind when I present this, because I think that my personal experiences have definitely shaped the way I have designed this. So another thing that I did was a systematic search, and not to be confused like a systematic review, that is not what it was, but I systematically tried to look at the decolonization and diversity initiatives in UK higher education libraries, including special libraries, health libraries. I'm going to say other ones that I didn't quite understand that well myself. And this wasn't to specifically create something, but I think to have an idea of what was out there, because I had worked specifically in one academic field with both UK scholars, American scholars quite a bit, and mainland Europe, but I had, I think, a more anecdotal idea at that point of what's happening in the UK. So I tried to do a systematic search going through library web pages from university pages, see what was happening. And I think this also feeds into how I look at decolonization versus diversification, because as you might have noticed, I very specifically talk about diversification here. And even that, I think, needs to be seen with like little quotation marks, because the thing is, the work I do here, and I think a lot of the work we do, is not decolonization, because it is not, because decolonization, as has been said, is not a metaphor. It is meant to be a disruptive practice that reallocates lands, resources, information, networks, and that is ultimately not what we have done. And I think that's why, for me, it is quite important that I don't call it that. And not because this work isn't political, it is, but because it doesn't have that reach or depth. And I recognize in myself that that is not power I have. And also because my family's from Suriname, which is a previous Dutch colony, having also studied that is really important to me, that we recognize that difference, that the things that my people and other peoples have experienced through colonialism is not something that we are redressing or addressing or in any way balancing with a lot of the work that is being done. And that is a very personal interpretation. It is not a personal critique of anyone who has made different decisions about this. I think it is just to kind of show how I come at this topic. And I think also to show that my own position is not a neutral one, and I'll be very open about that, and that the way that I look at this topic is also very colored by my identity as a mixed race woman and as a certain second language second language speaker of English. I have forgotten the phrase, but English is not my native language, as the accent might have suggested. And all these things feed into that. And I think that is also what the little image denotes, which actually has been included at the request of someone who's also here, that decolonization, I feel, is a word that is very often not used in what I think how it should be used personally, and that I think it has a real risk of both watering it down, but also, and I'm going to be a little bit harsh here, that we sort of reward ourselves for work we haven't done, because we have a investment in positioning ourselves in a certain way politically and socially. And I think that vocational art has been quite dangerous in this, in that the archetypical librarian frames and presents themselves as invested in equity and diversity and inclusion. And that if we don't do that work, we kind of, that view breaks down, and with that, the value of ourselves and our work breaks down. So we have, I think, almost a toxic investment in being presented a certain way. But then also, if we examine this too closely, there's a real risk that it turns out that we haven't done this right. And I think that can be really difficult to sit with and to work on. However, that doesn't mean we can't do it. And I think this is maybe only tangentially related to what I'm presenting here, but I think it's an important point to make because, again, it has framed how I've approached this issue. On a more practical level, so one of the main realizations I came to is that there is a disconnect, at least in the materials I saw and the things I read and what I sort of analyzed, between the lists, the collection, and the pedagogy. So we have reading lists, and then we have library collections, and then we have the teaching side of things, and there's obvious links between all of those, as we will all know. But when we talk about diversification and decolonization, it seems that we don't critically think about how these subjects are actually related and how the power links between these work. And I think that's one thing that I always try to hammer down, because I normally also work on this of academics. We cannot purchase suggestion ourselves out of systemic racism, because it is, every now and again, I will have an academic say, oh, but if I just get this book, and I'm like, grand, great start. I love that for you. We have to move beyond that. You can't just buy a book and call it a day, or replace a source and call it a day, because you're not interacting with the research or with the material and with the system. And I think this kind of leads into the next point, is what is in the list, which my questions will always go on, because you might have noticed I purposefully haven't included sources in this list because of the activity we'll do later. But if there is one, I think, source that I would heavily recommend everyone look at, it's actually Michelle's talk of last year on what reading lists are doing. And I think anyone who works with reading lists, be it in professional services or academics, should probably listen to that, because I think it is so key to reading list diversity. Because if we question the materials on the list, but then we don't question the list itself and its function. And I think that is something that I find questionable, funnily enough. So I think some questions I always have is, what is the goal of a list? Like, what is this list doing? Is it a purchase suggestion list for the library so we can say we've decolonized our collections? And is that why we're using this? Is it an obligatory standard, as I think Darren mentioned in last year's talk in response to Michelle, that the university has set up with like course validation? Or is it so students can find certain materials? And I was sure that they are, which leads me to, how do students actually use lists? Because we often say that we are diversifying or decolonizing in response to students. I think which is fair, which we're doing what our students have asked us to, supposedly. But have we actually checked that whether the work we are doing matches with their expectations, and whether we correctly understand how they engage with a list? Also, how do academics engage with this list? Because ultimately, all three of us, so students, academics, and librarians, need to be involved in this process. And I think for that, we need transparency and understanding how all of us use this list and how we see it, because I don't think that we can really claim to do any effective work without understanding how our other stakeholders are engaged with us and with our work. And I think these are very key questions, and they will be very different per institution. I don't have answers for this. These are answers you will have to go out and find yourself, I'm afraid. Because in one institution, even in one course, this might be different, because I work at quite a large institution. It's a Russell Group, and different courses will engage with lists differently, and different areas will do so differently. And obviously how academics engage also shapes how students engage. But I think it is something that when you start out diversification initiatives, I think it is important to ask these questions first, because they will shape your approach, or at least I hope they will. And I think then we kind of get into the more theoretical points of, how do reading lists relate to pedagogical practices, if at all? So today's activity will include a reading list, but as a pedagogical tool or as an exercise, but they don't always do that. So how do lists relate to teaching? I think that is my biggest question here, because we can do with a list all we want. We can put all these marvelous things on there, but if they're not taught, what have we done? If we have put these materials in a collection, but no one reads them and no one engages with them, and they're not picked up in teaching and in practice and in our thinking, what have we achieved? And I think that is maybe a difficult question to think about, but I think it is important because it is so key to the work. And similarly, how do reading lists relate to collections? Do we think that if we have diverse lists, we'll have diverse collections? And we might do so with enough time, potentially, depending on how your acquisitions work. But is that a fair process to follow, and should we stop there? Because it will be years and years, and maybe even decades before we see the effect of reading lists on collections due to the size of some of them. And that still doesn't really address issues around packages and subscriptions and like all kinds of other materials. And similarly, how do our collections relate to our pedagogical practices, and do our collections actually reflect pedagogical practices? I know in certain institutions, especially those that base their buying on lists, we might think that they do, but I think it's important to think about the reality of this, and I think sit down with academics and see how they incorporate resources and whether they use our collections and in what way students use collections, which kind of links back to my previous set of questions. So that is sort of a primer to this. And I think maybe a very simple sounding question: why do we need diverse lists? Who benefits from this? Is a list diverse, or is it what I call equitable? Does it give access to knowledge in the same way, and does it highlight resources in the same way? Because something I sometimes see, and I've seen as a student myself, is that there will be this one like special lecture in which you get all the people of color, all the women together in one spot. And I suppose that theoretically that was diverse, or maybe a lot of like background reading is from different kind of backgrounds. But if the core and centerpiece of a list is still the exact same as it was 10 years ago, is it diverse really, or is this tokenistic? And I think that's where I prefer to think about equitable lists. So I recognize that a list itself can't be equitable in the same way that it can't decolonize, but it's, I suppose, almost a thought exercise to have. And also, what is the result of a diverse list? What are we aiming for? Are we aiming to say we have X amount of diverse lists? Are we aiming to have a certain level of student or academic engagement with this topic? Are we aiming to have diverse collections? Like, who benefits, and what's the point of this? And I think, again, this leads into the assumptions that underlie diverse, or just reading lists in general, as if you know the previous slide. And what assumptions do you make in your institution? And again, that is not a question I can answer or even make suggestions for, because that is so dependent on your work and subject area, most likely. But also, why do we stop at lists? And just, or do we stop at lists? And if we do, why do we do that? Are there other areas we have the power to address? Or are we attempting to address these other areas through reading lists? So are we attempting to address our collections through reading lists, which is an approach I have observed in universities. And I think these are questions, again, that will differ depending on your job role and your institution. But I think that it is definitely key that we don't stop at reading lists. If I had a recommendation to make, it is to, because I think it was a good start, and I definitely respect a lot of the work that has been done on the topic, and I know people attending here have done that themselves. But I think we have to push forward with that. And I think that kind of leads me to my big question is it about lists, or is it about literacy? Because I'll actually stay here for a second, because as I made this reading list for the EMCA for IJ group, I think one of the things that I've noticed in the process is that I'd kind of collect these resources and I'd speak to academics, and some of them were absolutely brilliant people. I knew their work, and I'd gotten to know them through this project. And they would come to me at that point, a second year PhD student, who was also interdisciplinary. So my background is in linguistics or in conversation analysis. I was a STEM student before this. So someone relatively inexperienced, relatively young, kind of became a authority figure on this. And I thought, why is this? Why are they coming to me? Why are all these absolutely brilliant people asking little ratty old second year PhD me? And I think one of the things I heard, and I still hear when I do this with academics, is I don't know where to start, and I'm afraid of making a mistake, and I don't know how this works, and it's really overwhelming. And I think, and it wasn't until I was actually, a bit embarrassingly, in one of my local pubs having a chat with a friend of mine about this, and he just said, well, it's a skill issue. And it was meant as like the meme joke. And I thought, you know what it is? It is a skill issue, because in this work and having done it iteratively and having had these conversations, having looked for material, I've developed a skill. And all this work, it isn't about books on the list. Ultimately, it is about how I have learned to look at literature, how I have learned to think about academic resourcing and about the pedagogy behind that. And that is why they're asking me. But also, in a way, if I allow them to keep coming to me and hand them the resources, they're not learning. And And I have already sort of internalized this practice myself. And I don't think I can look at reading lists or at academic resources or at academic authority or even sort of like certain publishing things the same way, because I've been doing this work and I've sort of internalized it as a literacy skill. And I think that is really the core of what I'll be trying to explain here, is that it isn't about books on the list. It is about how you look at information. And I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit at a critical librarianship conference. So I think the dimensions of diversity I look at, because I think the key point of this is that I believe that diversity in academic resource or academic context isn't the same as our colloquial understanding of the word. Colloquially, we think about people, we think about diversity, staff diversity, or I don't know, demographic diversity. But I think that in an academic text setting, that word means something different, and I think we need to unpack that. And that is what I've attempted to do here. And I've sort of split it up in like nice bullet points. And in the next image, I've split it up in like a nice image. It isn't this separate. It's kind of a big network. It's why I really liked Gurnham's talk yesterday, because actually the idea of rhizomatic thought is what inspired this as well. So I was quite pleased to see that some very niche and obscure theory being applied in similar ways. So to talk you through it, the sort of dimensions I have worked with here are identity, which is indeed about the author identity, the one you might be familiar with, which is about authors, intersectionality, institution, where has it been published, so by whom. The representation aspect of literature, which is more about who has this been written. Is this representative data? Whose perspective are we hearing here? Is it respectful representation? Who is talking about whom? Because I think something that struck me as I was sort of speaking to other scholars and students is that this one woman said, and she was a Muslim, and she said, why is it all these white men writing about Muslim women? And that is obviously something I had never thought about, not being from that background myself, but I thought, you know what, that is a very important point. And I think that also needs to be considered, not just the author, but also what are they writing about? Then there is also the side of access, and this is something I'm still working on how to phrase it. Because I think that knowledge equity, and I think the openness, availability, and transparency of the process and the literature are also key aspects when we talk about academic diversity, both in terms of who can access this literature and this information, who has access to knowledge, and I'll, for example, also say we do open access publishing, and this is less about reading this, but more generally about what this represents. We do open access publishing, which is great. And I'd say we have this PDF, which already might have some accessibility issues with all the nice images and the formatting, and it is God knows what size. And that works for us. We have stable broadband connection. We have the technology to access this. We have the screens. We have everything. But say you are elsewhere in the world, having a heavy PDF is really, it can be a barrier. And I think, as we all remember from the early 2000s, downloading a large file can be really disappointing when it's waiting for that little image to load. And you're not sure if this is what you'll need. So you're there like, blink, 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 blink. You're like, oh, that's not what I needed. And you've just wasted your bandwidth and your time on that. And I think that is an access issue as well, is that the systems that we use, as Naomi has said, can also be barriers. And this is maybe less reading lists, but also I think still applicable in are the materials that we've put on that accessible to people, both in the classic accessibility sense of the word, but also in the sense of, is it just, can students use this at all? Another part of this, I think, is the co-design and co-production side of reading list. Is are people able to, are students or other users able to provide feedback on the list? Can they say, well, actually, I read this and I think there's an issue. Or actually, I read this really marvelous book or this article that came out last month, and I think it should be included. And do they have power there? And I think that might also be an important part of when we talk about reading list diversity, is that lists themselves shouldn't be static and they should be accessible by multiple parties. And that is perhaps, again, less about the content, but more about the structure. So yeah, this one is not phrased as well, I'm aware, and it's something I am working on myself still, because this is not my regular area of expertise. And then the fourth one is about the depth. So it's thinking about the critical hierarchy, the hierarchies of which these texts exist, the gaps in the literature, the assumptions we make about literature, whether there is a space for grey literature or different types of different types of materials. And I think it's really about going into depth on what a resource is, be it a specific resource that you're working with, or be it a resource that might not be there, and kind of thinking about, I think power is a very important, I think, concept to keep in mind when coming from sort of this dimension or approach to it. And then the last one is about interaction or breadth, which is very much about contextualizing a resource, the interdisciplinarity of a resource, the application, or as I say, I had this really, really good conversation with someone in engineering actually about diversity of materials and decolonization between brackets. And something he did on his course, and I thought this was actually really brilliant, was that, so they had these projects and they worked on these sort of applications of knowledge. And then the next step would be to think, I think in this case, that he worked with students in Nigeria and how they would execute a project like this, and having to think about the practical limitations of this, or what access to resources, to infrastructure, and to knowledge you might have there, and both how to make the work that they had done accessible to others and usable to them, but also think about how they could improve things sustainably and respectfully. And I think it's that type of thinking that this requires, because, and I'm aware this could be used as a checklist, but I really don't want it to be. I want this to kind of be an internalized process that people can use. And I think something else to say here is that I've sort of identified areas, and they all interlink for starters, but they're also imperfect. I know that this work is imperfect and it is ongoing, and it won't apply equally to certain disciplines. And I think that that is actually, I think the point of it for me is that I want there to be something that everyone can take away, and that it will work with different styles of knowledge creation and different styles of teaching, and that there will be something that is more immediately applicable and something that might take a bit more thinking and more work. And I think the other thing about this is this, I actually would love if someone came back to me in 2 years or in a year's time and said, you were incredibly wrong, and I've changed it and I've entirely overhauled it, or I've thrown it out the window and done something completely new. Because I think that is ultimately what we need to be doing here, because I don't think this should be sort of solid standardized theory in any way. I think this needs to be a skill that we develop and a form of literacy that we have. And as such, it is important to keep developing and also to make mistakes. I think this is one of many, many iterations of the work I have done on this, and there will be many more. And I think thinking about it as a skill has also made me less afraid to make mistakes on this, and I think own up to that and admit to that. And I think that has been really important to this as well. And I think viewing it as a skill also has that benefit that we acknowledge that it is a living, breathing process that requires almost making mistakes is a requirement to this. And I think that is actually really brilliant and quite beautiful. I should have clicked that before and it didn't work. Lost my mouse. Give me a second. There it is. This is more of a visual representation of what I've just said, which I'll give everyone a minute to have a quick look at. Again, it is a flawed representation, is not absolute. It is very much meant as this is a different way of looking at it if text doesn't help you. And I suppose it really is a sort of, because under CC BY, anyone is free to take this and remix it and tear it apart and put it back together and apply it where they want to. That is sort of the spirit of this as well, because I think that is an important element when we talk about this sort of diversity and equity. And then my last one, and this is mostly a metaphor, but I sometimes do use it practically. Again, it's really just a metaphor how we think about it, where we sort of have different levels of how we can consider this, where we can think, because I like to think about this work almost as having a different method to resourcing and to literature. And I think that in my experience has also helped me communicate it better from STEM backgrounds, because I myself sometimes find it helpful to think about it that way as a STEM ex-STEM person, and not because I don't think this work isn't political. It is absolutely political. I'm not trying to detract from that, but I think sometimes putting it in a different framework almost makes it easy to translate. So to kind of talk you through it, I think on the surface level of this, we can kind of think about the data, which is, I suppose, is the data itself diverse? Is the data that we use for research, is it representative? Is this not a stratified sample? I think then sort of the second level is kind of thinking about literature, or maybe thinking about how this has been collected, is there bias, and what kind of literature does this data go into? So which is kind of a second layer of thought of, right, we thought about what the data is doing. Now we look at the work that the data has affected. Then if you think about that further, you can kind of think about the methods, which is, both how is this being composed, how do these things act in relation to each other, how are articles connected to each other, but also what is being referenced, how is it being referenced, where do things originate? That is sort of kind of going down in asking the questions. And then I suppose at the lowest, well, the highest level is kind of thinking about methodology, which is kind of thinking about the epistemic principles that guide research. How does it affect knowledge? How does it affect knowledge-making systems? How is the system itself functioning? And I know this might not be helpful for some and might be helpful for others to think about it this way, and kind of the levels or layers at which you can ask these questions and how these questions have different kind of, I want to say depth to them, but different layers to them. And I think this also feeds into sort of the other reasons why I refuse to call this decolonization, is because I feel that until we have, I think, mastered the top three and are able to ask questions about epistemic systems and systems as a whole, we can't decolonize, because we cannot decolonize something we do not understand and that we are unable to comprehend and criticize. And I think to effectively criticize a system, you need to understand all its composite aspects. And I think similarly, until we are able to sit with the discomfort and the difficulty of this work, I don't think we can decolonize. And I think also because decolonization is in itself so disruptive and requires this reallocation of resources. You can't reallocate until you've understood the system that allocates. And I think this also feeds into questions around AI and technology, which again is certainly tangential, but I think is about this as well, is that until we understand what our literature is and what our data is and how the information in there relates to us, to reality, and to our research, we can't really say that we've understood AI, because any bias in the original source material will be reflected in technology. And I think that the more we work with these kinds of technologies that we cannot understand by nature, because there is no way that someone can be an expert on all these things and be an expert on AI. I tried, my original degree was actually going to be in AI, and then I found out I hated programming, so that was a bit disappointing. But even that, I think, just to illustrate, I couldn't do it all either. And I think that is going to be a bigger and bigger problem. So I think it is really important that we start thinking more about the structures and sort of processes behind resourcing and behind literature if we are to start using them en masse. And I think that we kind of need a sort of critical literacy as a skill, and like almost critical resource literacy will be essential to this, which is what this work attempts to do. It's kind of trying to give tools and starting points from which to build this skill, and everyone will do this differently in the end. So now we've gotten to the activity, and I think, Michelle, if you could stop recording in a second. So what we'll be doing here is that we'll be creating a reading list about diversity and pedagogy together on a Padlet. I know this is a very broad kind of topic, and that is on purpose. It's purposefully vague because it is meant to be a learning exercise. It is not meant to be like anything formal. So I have pre-created a few like headers so you can add resources under. If you feel a new one is needed, please do, but don't like overpopulate. And I think this is actually the key part of this exercise, that if you add a resource, I'd like for you to add like 1 or 2 sentences explaining why this resource is being added, and you can refer back to the things I have mentioned. But I think it is really about, as you might have been told in maths, about showing the steps and kind of showing the thinking, because I think that the thinking and the reasoning behind a resource here is much more important than the resource itself. Because I think once you can do the thinking, it becomes second nature after a while. And this is also something I do with academics, is I sort of ask them to do this, and I ask them about to think about any of these. And if they get stuck in one category, I then ask them to move over to another sort of dimension, or to just ask themselves other questions. And I think some of them, because I think I've run this once, like thrice, so the same group 3 times. And towards the end, they kind of come up with like their own questions and their own sort of dimensions in their head, which I thought was perfect. They don't need to follow what I tell them, actually. And just remember, this is a learning exercise, so it is fine to make any mistakes. And I think as a note, if you have like subject-specific resources, so say something about reading diversity and mathematics, or a specific maths resource, or a literature resource, I currently have one that says just subject-specific resources. If that one does get entirely out of hand, feel free to make another one. It is just because I want the focus to be on lists themselves and pedagogy rather than specific subject resources, because I think it's a bit different in how we interact with those. I'll put the link in the chat in a moment once I stop sharing. Alternatively, this is also going to be the rest of the time will be for questions and discussion, because actually I'd love to hear what all of you think. And I think equally, if you disagree with me, that's actually marvelous. That would be perfect, because I think ultimately that is at least how I learn, and I think a lot of us learn is by having that interaction, having someone go, actually, I think you've forgotten something, because I'd love to be proven wrong. But yeah, just so you know, you have the option of being in writing, the Padlet, discussing, and there's no pressure. And I shall now share the link.